Good morning, John. Well, I have another video that I've come across. Have any of you seen this yet? Have you found this? A couple of you have. This is on Prime Video if you have Amazon Prime. And there are 3 episodes that have been completed and broadcast. And it looks like there are at least 5 more to go. There are at least 8 in the first season. What do you think? Can I recommend it? I think it's well done. Now, they do take liberties with the story of David. They make like The Chosen, they make a storyline. But I don't think that I don't think I've seen anything that I would take issue with. I mean, it couldn't have been that way. But it is really well done. And if you would like a good refresher on the life of David, so far at least, I think I can recommend it to you. And if you already have Prime, it's free, so hey, not much to lose. Well, we have come in our journey with the life of Christ to the Tuesday of Passion Week, as you know. It's not a pleasant day. It's a day of confrontation, primarily, with the religious leaders of the Jewish nation. And it's recorded in all of the Gospels, but in the book of Matthew, there is an entire chapter devoted to Jesus' rebuke of the Pharisees, Matthew 23. I guess maybe if I had my choice, I might skip it. But I don't think that we can do that. I think it's an important part of Jesus' teaching. We see Jesus in an entirely different light. This is not the gentle Savior. This is not the shepherd. This is somebody who has had his last nerve stepped on. And his frustration and his humanness comes to the forefront. The Pharisees and scribes, who were the brunt of his lecture and his condemnation, were not bad people. They were the highest regarded religious leaders of the Jewish nation. But they had really gotten off on the wrong foot. They had gone far astray. And Jesus is going to rebuke them in some of the strongest language that you will ever hear him use. The reason we can't skip it, among other things, because we don't have the option of leaving out any of Jesus' instructions. But I think that we need to look at it very seriously internally and individually and say, I don't want to be in those shoes. I don't want to be that kind of a person. We mentioned in closing last Sunday, life is not just about the destination. It is a journey. It's a journey of discovery. It's a journey of growth, of learning, and therefore, inevitably, of change. If we never change our mind about anything, then we haven't learned anything new about anything. And there's always other things to learn. The Pharisees were obsessed with the right doctrine as a work necessary for salvation. I don't get any indication that the Pharisees cared at all about your heart, your motivation, your emotions, your dedication to anything except the letter of the law of Moses. It didn't matter what your intentions were even, as long as you obeyed diligently and to the nth degree their interpretation of the traditions that they had developed out of the law of Moses, then you were in good standing. Anything less than that, you were a reprobate, you were out of line, and in Jesus' case, you were fit to be crucified. That's a dangerous place to be. And such was I. And as I look back on it, I cannot deny that I grew up in an atmosphere and in a society in which it didn't matter what you believed as long as it agreed with me. It didn't matter what you taught as long as it agreed with me. And what I believed and what I grew up being taught was that it wasn't nearly as much, and we would never say it this way, but this was the actuality of it. It wasn't nearly as much who you knew as it was what you knew that was going to save you. We had people across the street from our church who believed in the same Jesus, taught 90% of the same things that we taught. But they had a piano in their building, and they had a missionary society. And some of them even went so far astray as to having women participate in public worship. And we were compelled to convert them so they wouldn't go to hell. And you know, we could, you know what I'm talking about. I remember trying to, I had a dear friend, he was my chorus teacher in high school, not a lot older than me, a full-blooded Choctaw Indian, and we got to be good friends. And he was a Methodist. And so obviously, it was my God-given duty and responsibility to save his soul, whether he wanted it saved or not. And he was spending the night with me one time. I'll never forget this. And we were arguing about communion, the scriptural way to take communion. And I was proof texting him, of course, which is what we do, right? We proof text. And, you know, the Methodists take it, quarterly or annually or something, I don't know. And we take it only on the first day of the week and on every first day of the week. And I started out saying, if Jesus had not intended for us to take the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week, he would not have instituted it on that. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. I don't think that was Sunday. You know, it looks like it might rain. Jesus pleads for our unity. And the only way that you and I can be in unity is for you to agree with me. That's the Pharisaical attitude. And that's what has scared me to death as I have grown older and learned more about the full gospel of Christ. And goodness gracious, the first time I tried to teach Romans, it was a disaster. How could I possibly teach Romans the way I had grown up? How terrible to be so harshly judged by Jesus for demanding observance of law and neglecting more important matters. Jesus declared that some commandments are greater than others. And the greatest is what? Love God and love your neighbor. When I think about all the things that divide us in the Christian world, not very many of them were ever even spoken about by Jesus. We have taken the writings of Paul and some of the other gospel writers and created a tradition, just like the Pharisees did, and bound our tradition on everybody else. And I don't want Jesus talking to me or about me the way he talked to the Pharisees. And that's what we're going to unpack today. Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must be careful to do everything they tell you. That's Moses' seat, by the way. That's not an allegory. That's an actual place. There was a place in the synagogue called Moses' seat. That gentleman sitting there is my friend Ben Bezaritas from California. I took that picture in Chorazin. Moses' seat in the synagogue at Chorazin. This is where Ben was sitting. The seat of Moses is a ceremonial chair in a synagogue that symbolizes the authority to teach the law of Moses. Who would sit on the seat of Moses? Somebody who was in line with the Pharisees. If you weren't in line with the Pharisees, you wouldn't want to sit there. It would not be a pretty sight. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads, and those loads were not just the law of Moses. They were primarily and mostly their own traditions, which was their interpretation of the law of Moses. Those are the things that Jesus violated, if you wanted to. He didn't violate the law of Moses. He violated some of the traditions of the Pharisees, put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Contrary to that, Jesus says what? My yoke is easy, my burden is light. Everything they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries wide and the tassels of their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogue. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplace and to be called rabbi by others. I think most of you probably know phylacteries and tassels, but just in case some of you might not, these are pictures of those phylacteries. They're small leather boxes containing Torah verses. That's verses from the first 5 books of what we call the Old Testament, that were worn by Jewish men as a reminder of God and the commandments. It's a way of complying with Deuteronomy 6 and 8, where they're told to tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the doorposts of your houses and on your gates. I looked for mine, but I couldn't find it. But I bought one of the little mezuzahs when I was in Israel. It's a little box, just a little rectangular box. And that goes on the door frame of the outside of your house. And as you come in, you touch the mezuzah and you recite a Torah. Every time you go in or out, you touch the mezuzah. That's what that doorpost, writing on the doorpost is. The phylacteries are the little boxes, the little square boxes. One's on his head, the other's on his biceps there, and it's bound with the leather binding. A very literal interpretation of that command. The verses must be written in black ink on parchment, especially prepared for this purpose, using the skin of a clean animal. You know what a clean animal is. This is ceremonially clean. You couldn't use a rabbit skin. You had to use the skin of an animal that was ceremonially clean. Other rules specify the type of writing instrument to be used. There are only certain quills that you could use to write on that with. The number of printed lines devoted to each verse, the arrangement of the pieces of parchment within each compartment, and the list go on and on. Now, how much of that was in the law of Moses? 0. But if you did not do that precisely as prescribed, what was the judgment against you? You were not acceptable. You were in violation. And that's the Pharisaical way. That's what Jesus is ranting about and raving against. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And do not call anyone on earth father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. Well, just like the Pharisees, some of us in my tradition took this message of Jesus condemning the Pharisees, creating traditions and laws as a burden upon people, and we wrote this into a law. So I would be very uncomfortable calling a Catholic priest father. And if I really want to be persnickety about it, I would have to challenge what I called my dad. We have these other terms in Christianity, abbot, papa, patriarch, pope, supreme pontiff, cardinal, bishop, archbishop, father, priest, pastor, elder, deacon, etc. We did not grow up calling any religious person father. I still don't today. I just can't get past it. I'm not going to bind it on you, though. And he's certainly not talking about your biological father. But we don't have any trouble labeling people elder or deacon.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I have a cousin who's a Catholic priest. I call him Kevin.
I admit, I'm really uncomfortable because I've been so ingrained with that this is a law. We turned Jesus' rebuke against the laws of the Pharisees into his own law and made it binding upon ourselves and others. I don't think that, and this is just me, I don't think shepherd and minister were ever intended to be titles or offices. I think they were ministries and services. We call it elder with a big E, capital E, and deacon, which isn't even an English word, with a capital D, and we've created them as titles. I'm not sure that Paul ever intended that to be the case. The greatest among you will be your servant. Oh, no. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Everything about the kingdom of heaven is upside down. Just the opposite of what the Pharisees were. And they could not understand it, and they certainly couldn't abide it, and they couldn't accept it. Now then, we're going to get into the woes. Now it's going to get serious. There are 7 woes coming, actually 8 if you have a King James Version, because King James Version adds one more that the others don't have. Like we needed one more. But here's one. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. What do we think about when we think about woe? What are some synonyms for woe? Just let me hear. What's a synonym for woe? Tragedy. Go ahead, Jeff. Let Jeff think about it a minute. Give me a synonym when he gets through.
Suffering.
Go ahead.
The scripture said this not turned on.
Well, Don knew you were going to talk, so he turned it off.
That's how it goes. The scripture said they ought to be similar as they should and read about the scripture.
Very good. Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Synonyms for woe. Tell me about woe. What's another word? Disaster? Disastrous? Condemned?
Yeah. Beware.
Mm-hmm.
Shame. Beware.
Beware. Yes. For sure.
Shame one.
Try some of these. Misery, sorrow, distress, wretchedness, sadness, unhappiness, heartache, heartbreak, despondency, despair, depression, regret, gloom, melancholy, gloom, despair, and agony on me. That's woe. Or as we say in Texas, you ain't going to be happy. Ain't going to be good. That's serious. That's serious when it comes from the Son of God. Right? I don't want to be a Pharisee. You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven. What's the kingdom of heaven? The kingdom of heaven is where God reigns. You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. How do they do that? What are some ways that they did this? How did they shut the doors of the kingdom in people's face? Kicked out of the synagogue, absolutely. You do it my way or you're gone, buddy.
They blocked people from Jesus.
They stood between him and Jesus. You took your life in your hand if you were a disciple of Jesus.
Withdraw fellowship.
Withdraw fellowship. They would have named it that way if they'd thought of it, but they did it in other ways. Well, they were certainly overburdening with their rules, were they not? They placed rules on people that they couldn't keep. They didn't bind it on themselves, they bound it on them. They were hypocrites. They had double standards. They didn't require themselves what they required of their students. They excluded the unworthy, the untouchables, the non-Jewish. They were intended, the children of Israel were intended to be a light to the world, and they instead built walls to keep the world out. If you were unclean ceremonially, if you didn't look like them, smell like them, you were excluded. You were the untouchables. Would you agree that they focused on the minors and missed the majors? How many of their traditions, and we're going to see more of them specified in these woes coming up. Certainly, as you said, they opposed Jesus, everything about Jesus and his message, and finally thought they had shut him up by nailing him to a cross. Wow. Maybe we could skip this one. What are some ways that we might do the same thing? Anybody want to go out on a limb?
The first thing that comes to mind, shutting the door on Jesus, is when we actually convict somebody. And I mean, one of the habits of our past was, you're going to hell. That shuts the door, because there's no way for conversation. You've already condemned them.
Yeah. Let me get one here.
This was before my time, but I remember when I was thinking college, I was talking to a man who had been a member of the church. And he said, "Are you still going to the Church of Christ?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "What do they teach now about secret societies?" I had no idea what he was talking about. But in his time, that's why he left the church, because he was a member of a secret society.
Yeah, right. I know what you're talking about.
True story. A young lady who was a bus rider, I believe she was 17, found herself pregnant. She came to church. Her parents didn't come to church. She had a friend, and the friend invited her to church. She rode the bus back in the day when we had the buses, the Joy buses. Found herself pregnant, and she went down front and confessed, "I'm pregnant." And everybody went down there and hugged her and loved on her, and everybody was crying. All the ladies were crying, you know. But then it came time for their traditional first baby shower in the building. And Mike is shaking his head. He already knows the end of the story. They had to have a meeting with the elders. The ladies who put on the showers had a meeting with the elders, and it was decided, we can't do that because it'll send a message to the other little girls that it's okay to do that.
Yeah.
So this was a girl who needed her church more than ever in her life. Her parents weren't there for her, obviously. And the church smashed her.
Yeah. Kind of in that line, we have churches of Christ here in our southeast community. When a visitor comes the second or third time, they're approached by the leaders and asked, "Is there a divorce in your family?" And if the answer is yes, they say, "Would you consider going somewhere else?" Been there, done that. Yeah. What else? What are some other ways that we shut up the kingdom against people, prohibit them from coming in?
I was just thinking, as a father of young children, maybe sometimes we can be a little too strict about, what they eat and things like that, because we don't want them to have, sugar, diabetes when they get older. So it's kind of like a hard thing. Like, do we let them have all this candy, or do we be so strict that they never eat any sugar at all? So
Yeah. And I love the fact that our kids southeast can play in the hallway, can play in the aisleway, and just try not to step on them. And it's just beautiful. I love it. That's not been our tradition growing up. Children were to sit and be still and be quiet and do not. Yeah, count the tiles on the ceiling.
I think one way we exclude people is by our own perception of what is sin. And I think back to my childhood when everyone would come forward and confess their sins. It was a scary thing seeing that as a child because it was like, oh, I'm going to have to come forward when I sin. And so I just think our perceived perception of sin keeps people out because we preach against all these things. Not saying we don't do what's right, but we exclude them from our membership based off their sin. Or we make it so they're miserable here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a weekly practice, of course, growing up, the altar call, and people would frequently come forward and confess sin, and they didn't confess sin, they just confessed that they had sinned. And then you get to fill in the blanks. Oh, wow. Wonder what they did. and I don't mean to make fun of confessing sin, because that's a scriptural thing to do. And there's a place and a time and a way to do that. We haven't figured it out yet. But, I can, and I don't mean to make fun of anybody, but there was a sweet lady, she was in the military actually in Fairfield, and would love her dearly. And at least twice a month, she would answer the altar call. And she would come down with, a very downcast countenance and come for prayer. And we would faithfully pray for her. And it's not wrong. I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's not a law. Anything else? Moving on. This is the one that King James adds in that none of the other modern translations include. It wasn't in most of the higher regarded manuscripts. King James says, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayer. Therefore ye shall receive the greater damnation." That's one of my AI-generated pictures. I couldn't find a picture I liked, so I asked one of the engine to give me a picture of a Pharisee devouring a house, and that's what it came up with. Well, we all probably can put faces to this in our background. And again, it's so easy for us to pass judgment when we shouldn't pass judgment, and I don't mean to do that. But it's easy to fall into this pretense mode where we do it for show, and the motive is just wrong. And Jesus says you're a hypocrite. James says pure religion undefiled before God the Father is what? Visit the fatherless and the widows in their affliction. Keep yourself unspotted from the world. That's not what the Pharisees were doing. Here's the third woe. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, a single proselyte. And when you have succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell. The Greek word here is Gehenna, the valley of Gehenna there next to the Kidron, as you are. Problem was not in making converts. They were commissioned to make converts. The problem was in how and why. Sadducees, just a word of course, about the Sadducees. They were a very exclusive group. The Pharisees were not nearly as exclusive as the Sadducees were. The Sadducees held strictly to a closed society. They were the elite. They were the keepers of the temple. They were the predominant force on the Sanhedrin. The Pharisees, when they did convert people, converted them not to God, but to the law of Moses. Part of that conversion, even today, if you want to become a Jew, and once in a while I hear people who convert to Judaism, it requires that you, if you're a man, you submit to circumcision. And of course, you have to go through, everybody has to go through the ritual immersion, like our baptism, only it's a mikvah. And that's part of the conversion process. There's a great deal more to it than that. But those are the physical things that you can see as a part of conversion today. The Sadducees were the people who guarded against all of the outside interference. There were a couple of different levels of converts, if you will. There were those who were called proselytes of the gate. Sometimes I think Paul refers to these as God-fearers. People like Cornelius, who were interested in the God of Israel, who were even worshipers of the God of Israel, but they did not comply with the physical requirements and all of the meeting of all the tradition of the Pharisees. And then there were the righteous converts who were fully observant. They did everything physically and emotionally and mentally to become fully compliant with the law of Moses and all of the traditions of the Pharisees. A Christian convert, on the contrary, should be about transformation, not about membership. I think that when you have my particular position of ministry, part of my responsibility here is reaching out to people who want to be members here and ushering them into the congregation. And it's very easy for me to become very focused on what we sometimes refer to as nickels and noses. How many? Are we getting more members this year than we did last year? What are we doing to make people members? And that should not be our focus. Our focus should be on taking people where they are and moving them forward into a transformative relationship with Jesus Christ. It should be about grace first. Transformation without imposing unnecessary rules or cultural expectations. We don't have to have everybody who comes into our midst conform to our traditions. They don't have to look like us. They don't have to be a copy of us. Christian conversion should be more about going out than expecting them to come in. It should emphasize discipleship over conversion. If we make them disciples, they will be converted. Depends on how you're defining conversion. If conversion just means becoming a part of this church, that's not conversion. Conversion is becoming a disciple, a talmidim, a follower, a learner of Jesus Christ. And I believe it should include inclusivity, I'm not saying it right, without compromise. In Galatians 3:28, neither male nor female, free or slave, rich or poor, all one. Complete inclusion. Nobody second level. We haven't got there yet. But we're working on it, right? Yeah. Fourth woe, what are you blind guides? You say if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But if anyone who swears by the gold of the temple, he's got to keep that oath. You blind fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift on the altar, he's bound to keep that oath. You blind men, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, anyone who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. We look at the we talked about it so many times. The Mishnah is a volume that fills a room. I mean, not a volume, it's multiple volumes that fill the room. And all of those are this kind of thing. Minutia, minor. And to us, we look at it and we say, that's silly. But do we do the same thing? Are we guilty of the same thing? Anyone who swears by the temple swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And anyone who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and by the one who sits on it. Then Matthew said in the Sermon on the Mount, if you remember, do not make any vows. Do not say by heaven, because heaven is God's throne. Do not say by the earth is his footstool. Do not say just say a simple yes, I will, or no, I won't. Anything beyond this is from the evil one. He's talking about integrity. But what did we do with it? We made a rule. When you go to court as a witness, and they call you to the bar, and you put your hand on the Bible, and you say, I swear, you done sinned, brother. You done sinned. Don't you know Matthew 5:33? Is that what Jesus was talking about? Don't think so. These are the rules that apply to oath taking. They were more obsessed with technicalities than the deeper meaning of their words. Reversed what's truly sacred. True value comes from God, not man-made systems or treasures. Completely missed the big picture. Don't get lost in details and miss God himself. And expose their spiritual blindness. Spiritual leadership should clarify, not confuse, what is holy. And there was nothing very clarifying about the contentious, argumentative traditions of the Pharisees. Well, our time is up. We're down to the fourth woe. So we will look forward to finishing the rest of these next week. The takeaway in all of this is, I as an individual, I as a leader of the Southeast Church of Christ, you as a congregation, the Southeast Church of Christ, you as an individual, we don't want to be a Pharisee. It's not a good place to be. Okay? On that note, have a wonderful God bless week.